All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Tonight we have a scintillating topic for you, which is the SAT and ACT. I see some folks here who are rising juniors or juniors now that school has started, and I also see a few folks who are seniors, which is great. And we may have a few extra folks join us as we go through tonight's presentation. Anne Marie is standing by to answer questions as they come up. So feel free to ask questions either through the chat room, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly of us as we go through. Either one is just fine. We're not going to have like a massive group of like 100 people here tonight. So it's totally fine to jump in and ask questions as you will. So let me do this. I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint up on the screen and start sharing the screen, all that kind of good stuff.
So Michael, do 20 to 30 minutes worth of presentation, and then we'll leave the remainder of the time open for questions. You can ask questions about anything, about the topic that we covered tonight, or about any part of our process, or any burning questions you have about college. So feel free to load those in your brain if you want to as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for that reminder. Okay, great. So here's the beginning slide. So here's our agenda for tonight. I want to go back in history. I was a history major as an undergrad, so I think it's always fun to see where in the world do these tests come from? Why are we even having to do them today, et cetera, et cetera. Then I want to talk specifics about the exams themselves. What are they? What do they look like? They've changed their form throughout history, and certainly even in recent times. I think all of us have been around when SAT was, for example, 3 sections as a mandatory, 3 mandatory sections, and then it went back to the 2 sections that we as parents knew back in the day when we were taking these tests. So I want to talk about the specifics so everyone's on the same page with that. I want to talk about preparation and how we can actually approach these tests for the best possible results. And then I talk about current day issues, because as we know, we live in the COVID era and test optional is on the news. Everyone's talking about it, but there may be some things that are a bit surprising that go along with that I'd like to talk about with everybody tonight. Okay, so a bit of background. I promise I won't go too deep into this, but at the turn of the 20th century, if you wanted to go to college, you took these things that were called college boards, and you had to know Greek, Latin, and physics. Can you imagine, Anne Marie, having to sit for an exam and go through your knowledge of Greek or Latin?
No, I would be in trouble.
We would all be in trouble, I think. But here you can kind of see the roots of some of the criticism. The early criticism of SAT was that it was extremely discriminatory. So if you went to an average public high school, you probably didn't do Greek. Didn't have knowledge of that. So if you went to Exeter Prep or one of the preparatory schools for the Ivies, then yeah, you would have had these types of subjects thrown at you in high school. So the SAT actually got its start in 1926. It was an aptitude exam that was essentially it was a critical reasoning exam that they wanted to make sure that everyone could think. And so in 1926, that was introduced, and then the ACT first got going in 1959. So clearly the ACT is the newcomer in the block. And as we said before, there have been tons of revisions to these exams. And you can even go back if you really want to dig into it. And you can see where like a 1220, for example, in 1989 doesn't mean a 1220 in present day terms. So even the scoring systems have morphed quite a bit over the years. So what is the big picture with these exams? For those of us who've looked at these recently, you'll notice that the SAT is back to essentially a 2-section exam that has an optional writing section. So you're definitely going to have a reading section. You're definitely going to have a writing section if you sign up for it, and then a math section. The SAT is 2 hours and 55 minutes in length, whereas the ACT is a 3-hour exam. So it's essentially the same length, maybe a hair more compressed on the ACT side of the house. You'll see that both the SAT and the ACT have these optional writing sections. That's one of the things I put giant red X's through them. If you're going to take these exams, my recommendation is to go ahead and complete them with the writing section. Just in case, for whatever reason, a year down the road, the schools change their policy and they actually want to see a writing section. And that has been done in the past because some colleges will want to see a proctored writing section. They don't necessarily want to just rely on a student's essay that they write during the admissions process. Sometimes they want to go back and see how do they write on their own in a time setting. On the SAT, you'll notice that the math section is very much geared toward algebra, which is great. When you start to think about when can I actually attempt the SAT, many students can do that in the junior year because they've already done algebra. Some equations are actually going to be given to us on this test, which is really, really nice. And then part of the math section for the SAT is that a calculator is required. Every year, gang, I hear students coming back saying, Mike, I didn't do very well on that first test because I forgot to bring my calculator, or my calculator ran out of batteries or whatever. So calculators are definitely a part of the SAT. If you're sitting for that exam, you need to make sure that you're with your favorite trusty calculator. And then the other difference I would say on the SAT versus the ACT is that in the reading section, the line numbers are actually referenced. When they start to ask you questions in the reading passage, they're going to say, hey, go back to line number 24. What is the author referring to here, or whatnot? So that can be very helpful for some students, especially those who might have learning differences and have a harder time digesting large reading passages. On the ACT side of the house, there's 4 sections, not 3. You've got an English, a math, a reading, and a science section. So that's the biggest difference in terms of structure between these two tests, is that the ACT has the science section. But down here, you're going to notice that the science section is a lot of jargon. There's a lot of graphs. It's not, hey, calculate molarity of this one particular, solvent or anything like that. They can't do that on a paper-based exam. So there is a lot of interpretation of graphs in the science section. Again, optional writing section, which again is not really optional. The math section here is definitely broader. It's based in trigonometry and geometry. Those are the two things that if I'm going to study for the ACT, I'm going to make sure I'm up on those types of material. And then in the reading section, there are no questions that were regarding evidence support. So they're not having you go back and look at specific line items. And again, as we mentioned before, slightly less time per question. So a lot of students will come back on the ACT anecdotally and say, man, I just didn't finish the reading section. I couldn't get through every single math question on this exam. So it's important, I think, and we'll talk about this in the preparation section, to pace ourselves and to learn the proper pacing of these exams. So what if I'm sitting here staring down the barrel of SAT or ACT? I know I want to take one of them. The question always arises, do the colleges care which test they receive from us, if at all? And the answer is, for the schools that are going to receive an SAT or ACT result from your student, they don't care. I've never seen a college come back and say, we're only going to take an SAT, or we're only going to take the ACT. That kind of died out 30 or so years ago with the fall of the regionalization of these exams. Now they're national. Colleges don't care which result they receive if they're asking for them. So for that, I'm always thinking about efficiency. I don't want to have to study for both of these tests, especially if I'm a junior. I'm heading into a year where I might be taking 4 or 5 AP courses. I may be playing a sport, times at a premium, pretty much any time, I think, with our students. So I just want to do one. I don't want to do both. So the diagnostic exam, we offer a 3-hour diagnostic test. I really encourage students to take this up front, because it will come back and tell you if you've done better on one, or you're likely to do better on another. Okay. It also has some really great diagnostic information that you could provide, for example, to a test prep person, saying, hey, these are the areas where I wasn't quite up to snuff. And then they can focus your preparation in those areas. So the diagnostic exam, if you haven't done it and you want to do it, all you have to do is text in your portal to Dee or Lori, and they will definitely set you up with a diagnostic test. It's part of your process with us. So some advice on test prep. I'm not a big advice giver. I don't like shoving things down people's throat. But my first piece of advice is it doesn't really matter how test prep gets done. Just do it. I'm grabbing Nike slogan here. It's really important to prep for these tests. I sat with a student today who's a junior at Lake Travis High School, and he has already done an initial SAT. And I asked him, hey, what about this result? This first one that you did last year as a sophomore, did you prepare for it? He said no. And that is the most common answer I receive from students, is that the first test that they did, they just did it for practice. And to me, that it's a little inefficient. I wouldn't do it that way. I would absolutely prep even for that first test, because you never know. You might go into that test and that may be the best one of the entire lot of the exams that you might take. So 20 to 40 hours of prep time, that's kind of what the doctor orders. That is the commitment that I think that students who are very serious about doing well on these tests will put in for one or the other. Online options are great, especially in this environment with COVID. Most students will do some sort of online preparation. Method test prep, which is part of our process at College Inroads, is definitely online. So you already have one option available to you. Setting a goal. If you do the diagnostic test, you take a PSAT, or maybe you went ahead and took an exam and you had an initial result. I think it's important to set a goal for yourself. And a lot of the times when I talk to students initially, they don't necessarily have a goal. They just want to make a good score. So in College Inroads portal, as you get going with us, you'll be able to see specific schools and what their median or their middle 50 percentile SAT or ACT scores are. So you can easily set a goal per the types of schools that you're applying to. Also set up a schedule. It's just like working out. I always think back in the days where I've had to do test prep for GRE, for GMAT, for SAT. I did my best when I set up a disciplined schedule. Method test prep, again, I'm not plugging this for everybody, but it has a very nice 20-week mapped out process to work from. And you can condense that if you need to, leading up into a test. But definitely take full-length exams. There's no better way to prepare for an actual test day than sitting under current test conditions. Give yourself that 3 hours and take these full-length mock tests. You can buy them online from Barnes and Noble. A lot of times they'll come in packs of 10. That sort of thing. I think at least 3 or 4 of those would be what I would do in preparation for an actual sitting for one of these tests. And feedback loops. This is a bit of systems engineering, but essentially you want to go back and retrace steps wherever you might have fall down in this process. I always think back in my days when I left the military, I took a job at Merrill Lynch as a financial advisor. And one of the things that was required was to take the SEC's Series 7 exam and the Series 66 as well. Anyway, bottom line was I met with my boss and he said, Mike, if you're going to go in and do well in this job, you're going to need to pass this exam, number one. And I give incentives. If you make a 90 or above on the exam, you'll get a $12,000 a year raise. If you fail the exam, you're fired. And at this time I had a young family and I thought, oh my gosh, well, I can see the carrot and the stick here, So I took 40 full-length 6-hour exams, 40 tests prior to sitting through that exam. And I laugh when I tell students about this because the day of my test, I'll never forget sitting in the anteroom of Sylvan Learning Center, ready to take this computer test. I was cool as a cucumber. I knew it was going to pass. I just didn't know if I was going to make the 90 or above. And in through the door walked another guy who's clearly taking the same test that I was because he had the big study books in his hands. But this guy was sweating. He was pacing back and forth. It was making me nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, I just don't want to be near this guy because he was so stressed out. Anyway, long story short, I took the exam. I made a 92. I got a raise and I got a speeding ticket on the way home from that test sitting that day. And I didn't care, just because it was over and I crossed that finish line. I had set a goal. I had done 40 full-length exams, which I don't think anyone needs to do for the SAT or ACT. But I did definitely, use Paper. I pay pens and papers. That's how I got it done. Just do it. To that first point. Okay, so let's launch into some jargon. Let's talk about test optional and test blind. In this day and age, everyone is hearing, hey, colleges are all test optional right now. What does that really mean? And is that really true? Okay, so the test optional means that the colleges, if the student says that they're going to submit tests, they will go ahead and take in that person's SAT or ACT result in the application process. Or if the student elects to go test optional for the school, if the school allows for it, then those things are just not part of the admissions process. They're not going to be looked at. They are going to be looking at other items to make a holistic decision as to whether or not the student is actually going to be admitted to the college or not. In 2004, only 800 colleges were test optional. That's about when I started educational consulting. And I'll never forget going to a conference in Florida and hearing from fairtest.org's executive director. And he was talking about, I think at the time it was only like 650 or 700 colleges, and they were really trying to gain traction in the world of higher education. When we fast forwarded this year, there are over 1,350 colleges that are test optional. So what does that mean for us? That means 75% of all the colleges that are baccalaureate granting, that's what we're going for, are test optional in this cycle, which is really great news for a lot of people because it gives you flexibility in how you actually apply to the school. Now, test blind is very different. Test blind means that the standardized tests are not considered at all. It doesn't matter if you flew to the college and handed them test results to their admissions director, they're not going to be used. And so here are some examples of that. Hampshire College, which most of us are not going to apply to, that's a small liberal arts college in the Northeast. Northern Illinois University, that's a regional college that most of us are not applying to. But the UCs, I have lots and lots of students that are applying to the University of California system, UC Irvine, UC Santa Barbara, San Diego, those types of schools. There's a lawsuit that actually came out prohibiting the UC system from using standardized tests in their admissions process. So they are test optional. And after 4 years, they're even considering not having any tests at all, but maybe even creating their own. Caltech is another notable school that is also test blind. So hopefully that gives you a little picture of what's happening in terms of those two phenomena. So what if I want to see a full list of the test optional colleges? This website here, fairtest.org, when you go into their menu, will list every single school. And it is a super lengthy list. And I'm not going to go off this PowerPoint because it's a pain to get back onto it. But when you go there, you can sort it by state to easily see, hey, if I'm applying to a school in Colorado, you can sort it by the state and find it. But here are some of the schools that are very notable that are on the optional list, including, Harvard and Bowdoin and Brown and Case Western, all these guys. Here are some optional colleges: Abilene Christian, Texas Tech, Trinity, Texas Christian, SMU, Rice, UT, A&M, basically all the major players. Today I went through the optional list and I was trying to find colleges that were notable and likely to be applied to from our client base. And I couldn't find any in Texas that were actually mandatory to submit test scores for this cycle, which is kind of a nice situation. So when are these tests actually offered? Okay, so what you can see, these are the closest dates, like August 28th coming right on up. It's too late to register for this one, obviously. But going into the latter part of the semester, you'll see that, usually in a semester, there's going to be 2 to 3 offerings of the exam. And then you can see in the summer, there's a June test and a July test. So from a strategic perspective, look ahead, try to book these in times where leading up to the exam is not the craziest part of May. For example, like taking these June tests are really hell on wheels for a lot of students who are taking a lot of AP exams and finals, because that's what's happening in May. So prototypically, these June results yield the worst results. So maybe try to stay clear of those if possible. So either, then just take a look at your scheduling and see what is going to be the best individually for us. So some misconceptions. Again, I heard a lot of students talking about, oh yeah, all colleges are now test optional. Well, guess what, gang? They're still required at schools like University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, University of Florida, Florida State, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a call to go ahead and take these exams, especially if you're a junior listening to this information and are interested in these schools. It's unlikely that they're going to go test optional next year if they're not already. And just because a school is test optional doesn't really mean that for merit aid or for scholarships that the school will also be test optional. Great question. That is a fantastic question to ask to your admissions rep, because every school is going to be a bit different on how they actually do it. And I'll show you some examples of that tonight specifically. And another misconception, my admissions bid for XYZ University is now doomed because I can't seem to hit my goal score. Well, not necessarily. The thing I always come back and say, hey, only 50 schools in the United States have acceptance rates below 20%. Those are the Harvards and the Stanfords and the Yale. More than half of all colleges admit 2/3 or more of their students. So don't sweat. There's always going to be a fit out there in the University of Schools. Anne-Marie, what's the current update on how many colleges there are in the United States right now that are four-year schools?
I think it's 2,406.
2,406. So guess what, guys? We'll find some good fits for you. Don't sweat. Okay, so here's an example of how an SAT or ACT score can actually lock in merit aid. Okay, so I pulled this directly off of Texas Tech's website today. So this is super current. And you can see, for example, here's your high school rank. You can look and see where you stand. And then if you hit certain scores, so let's say that you're within the top 10% and you hit a 30 ACT, you're definitely going to get $5,000 off per year at Texas Tech, which is great. If you bumped up to a 31, that increases to 7, which on the face of it may not be that big of a deal to you. But if you think about that over 4 years, that's an extra $8,000 off the cost of that school over 4 years from what you would have gotten from this award. So that's really nice. Okay. Here's another a way or an example how earning an SAT or ACT score can influence the award amount. And this is Trinity University. So here's a whole different, strata of school. It's a private institution. It's small. It's private liberal arts. It's not a giant public research school. If you have a 3.5 or above, notice there's nothing here about your class rank. It's just your GPA. You could get $18,000 to $30,000 annually. So if you're looking at that, Anne-Marie, what would you say could help get you this $30,000 award versus this $18,000 award?
Higher SAT score.
Shocking, right?
Shocking.
So yes, colleges still care about these damn scores. They don't do much in terms of predicting your success in college. They know that, but it sure has a huge influence in the US News and World Report ranking system. Okay, and other ranking systems as well, but notably US News and World Report. So even in this COVID era, colleges want to see students that really do well on these tests, period, end of story. And they will pay for it here in the bottom line. So what if I have learning differences? Yes, here are some of the differences between these two tests in terms of how you get accommodation. So SAT, you're typically going to get extra time or a quiet exam place or individual testing, through your high school counselor. Okay, 7 week lead time is required. If you are just wanting the same accommodations that you typically get through your IEP or your 504 program, it's pretty streamlined. Documentation, yes, you may need to have that. And here are some of the other accommodations that you might end up with. The ACT is also through the high school. It's only a 2-week lead time, which is kind of nice to at least submit and get an answer. If the diagnosis is reconfirmed within 1 year of the request and has been in place for greater than 3 years, it's a streamlined process. So it's a little bit different. Definitely documentation is required in any of these cases, and you might get small group testing, a scribe, multiple day exams, things like that. Some notable quotables. I won't go through these specifically, but you can see colleges are being flexible. Flexibility is super key. Colleges know that these standardized tests are not as good a predictor as your class ranks / grades / curriculum that you've undertaken in high school. That's totally it. But you also see colleges flexing their muscles and trying to help students who may not test well, which is great news. And that's I think why a lot of people are accepting of this test optional environment. So key takeaways here: flexibility. Make sure that the SAT, you understand that it's not the end all be all of college admissions. It never has been. Definitely sign up early for the exams. What we saw last year when COVID was really raging, test centers would shut down last minute, even the day before a sitting. So you want to make sure that you at least have a seat just in case, and definitely prepare well in advance. For those of your juniors, it may seem like you have 82 sittings for this test coming up, but I would encourage you to really be thinking about signing up for the latter first semester exams for either SAT or ACT. So preparation, definitely very important. Use time to your advantage. Definitely these tests still have sway in many colleges in the admissions office, and they definitely can impact your merit aid at some schools. And then lastly, if you need help or referrals, we are a phone call away. We've been around the block a few times. We know some test prep folks that are here in the community that do a great job with students one-on-one. We know folks who are just branded to do LD test prep, things like that. So if you need assistance, just reach out to us. We can help. Also, in your file system, there is a listing of local test prep folks that some of our clients have used. So you can obviously look at that reference guide as well. So that is the end of my prepared remarks. I'm going to stop the share.
Mike, would you say that our default philosophy is to go ahead and prep and take the tests?
Absolutely.
And let's see what the scores are. And then especially for seniors and kids that are juniors, for the schools that are going to be test optional, we can be strategic with you when it comes time to submit your college applications on which schools you want to send scores to and which schools you don't. So just know that you have some assistance and support there as well. But I would always encourage the kids to take the test, and let's see the hand of cards we're dealt, and then we can be strategic with you based on what the score is in comparison to the colleges that your student is interested in.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Okay, so great. Any other questions related to SAT, ACT preparation, any of that kind of good stuff?
Hi, good night, Michael. Anna-Marie, quick question. My son is an interim junior, and if I want to set with him like a deadline to do the SAT or SAT, what would you say that will be a good deadline?
Great question. I'm going to share my screen to answer that question, Marco. So let me do that really quickly. I'm going to pull up Joe Doe. He's our example client. So your question is centered upon what is the deadline? What should we be looking at? In the testing tab of every student's profile are all these test dates. I listed them on the PowerPoint, but they're here for you. It also gives the registration due date. So for example, if I was an ACT kind of person, if I knew that that was going to be a stronger test for me, I would start to look at these dates. So we're here, in between these two test offerings right here. I would say the December 11th test would be the one I would try for. Mainly, I want to get past the beginning of school. I want to have plenty of time to ramp up and prepare for that exam. I will have also, if I'm taking algebra or some of those basic math classes, I'm going to be deeper into that subject matter and be able to sit for the test a little bit more efficiently. And then it also gives me flexibility based on this result, depending on what happens, to come back through and do any of these other test iterations. Does that make some sense? So here, I'm looking at the end of the first semester as a junior, as the kind of the zone to be in.
And that would be my advice as well. You take one in the fall, take that like November, December, January, and then take one or two in the spring, do it in like February and April, something like that. The goal is to have maybe 2 to 3 solid test scores under our belt before we start applying. And that'll happen starting June, between junior and senior year. And so in Utopia, everybody would have their test score solidified before application season opened in June. And then, if Baylor comes back and says, hey, give me one more point on your ACT and we'll give you another $5,000 a year, then we have some time to prep and be able to take the test again if we need to. But especially with the juniors, you take the PSAT, then you take your first real SAT, ACT in the fall, and then you take, one or two in the spring would be my advice. I think that's in conjunction with what Mike said too.
Yeah, that's great. And the other thing that pops into my mind, Amory, when you mention that, when you get Marco 2 or 3 test iterations under our belt, then we can start looking at the super score. And we didn't cover that tonight because tonight was more about test prep, but a great position of power to be in is in between junior and senior year to be able to look at 3 different iterations of a test to handpick the best critical reading and the best math score, for example. And that's what ends up going to the college. Most college, not all, but many colleges, like the vast majority of them, will accept super scoring. As a matter of fact, they'll do it for you. They'll just say, hey, submit all your test scores and we'll give you the best benefit of the doubt for these exams. Now, interestingly enough, the SAT tends to be the one that colleges will super score. Back before COVID, almost none of them super scored the ACT for whatever reason. So that was the reason why we're saying, hey, do your best, always do the writing section, no matter what test you actually, whatever flavor you are doing, SAT or ACT. But I've even seen that starting to loosen up. There are more colleges these days that will super score the ACT, but it's still a minority of the colleges. So 2 or 3 test results are great. Okay, other questions? Yes.
So clarity on the super scoring. I thought I read somewhere, sorry guys, Anne-Marie and Mike, it's Tracy Mendez and Ray Seeger, but you knew that. So I thought I had read that some schools will ask you for all of the scores, even though they super score, with kind of, I guess, a look at trying to see the path you were on.
Yeah.
Mike, you're smiling. Is that real or is that Memorex or?
No, it's true at the uber elite level. If we're applying to a place like Harvard, they want to see every single score. They don't want you, they're not going to allow you to super score or present your best foot forward because they're getting so many applications.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
We're not in that ballpark.
No worries. Most of us are mere mortals.
Mere mortals. There you go. That's a fair one. And because we're, going into the senior year or momentarily, the advice as we're filling out resumes right now is to leave it test optional. At what point in time are we just waiting for this last round of SAT scoring to determine, or is there really a strategy? You mentioned earlier, Mike, about talking to your admissions rep about really, do we leave it optional? If you have a good resume, you've been working hard on your essays, is it an advantage or a disadvantage? Now, if we get that last 100 points that we're looking for, we'll probably hold on to it, but can you talk a little bit about that strategy, or is this the wrong session for that?
No, that's good. This is a great time to chat about that. And it really boils down to where are we applying? Like Anne-Marie was saying, it matters to where we're applying. If we are above, if we're in the upper 75th percentile, with our GPA, our standardized tests are up there, then absolutely we want to submit. If we're below like the bottom 25th percentile, then clearly we do not want to submit scores to that particular college. And then, the real question comes in on the applications. They're asking in some cases, hey, are you submitting scores or not? And they want you to draw a line in the sand. So in that case, you kind of have to be able to say, okay, I am not going to submit scores, and then they're not going to expect them. But if you come back and post an extra 100 points, fantastic, release them, and let them consider those later in the process. Where it gets tricky, Tracy, is in timing. For example, let's say we're looking at A&M, when they have a 1 November preferred deadline for application. If you submit scores past that 1 November deadline, then it's not going to go into the record at all. So we have to be able to be thinking, that's why I'm saying, think way ahead in terms of test dates, so that if we do, for example, an early November test or an October exam, at least we'd be able to see those results prior to releasing those to a college, if that makes sense. So there is definitely, it's not a one size fits all kind of situation. That's where Anne-Marie is saying, yeah, the application specialist job is to sit with Race or to sit with the student and say, okay, this school release, this one don't. let's wait on this one and see if we get the extra added bump points that we're looking for.
All right, so that's just part of the one-on-one process, that continued refinement. Okay,
That's
thanks,
right.
guys.
Mhm.
Who
Great
else has
question.
questions? That is a good question. Any other questions about this or any other part of our process or anything about college for that matter?
I have one quick question. So if we are prepping, so say we sign up for like the December SAT,
Mhm.
how many weeks prior to that should we really start like prioritizing SAT prep?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on the student and their activities. But in general, if it were me with an average load or a slightly more difficult load, because junior year is that, usually 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time is when you really want to start that ramp up process in earnest.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
And if we work that backwards too, it's about 20 to 40 hours per test. And so in your life, what would that 20 hours be? Now, you don't want to do 20 hours in one day. And so you want to be able to, to break it down into small bite-sized pieces and do a little bit, every day or every other day or what have you. Just incorporate it into your regular system. You're going to be online at some point anyway, every day. And so just do, a half hour, what have you, every day or every other day, just to incorporate it. I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to step on you.
No, not at all. That's a great comment. The other thing that I think about are those full length exams. You want to give yourself 4 or 5 of those prior to the test sitting. So if you back up 8 weeks, maybe 3 or 4 of those weekends, you actually sit for a 3-hour period under timed conditions and do one of those practice exams.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much.
You bet. Well, excellent, gang. I want to say thank you for joining us. If there are other questions that pop up, don't be a stranger. Jump in the chat room on your student's portal and fire away, and we will get an answer to you on questions regarding the SAT or ACT or anything else that might pop up in terms of college stuff.
Don't be
So-
shy. We're here to help.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Have a great night, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.